Did you know that there are a record number of Canadians experiencing randomized attacks? And also, did you know that there's a record number of Canadians dying of drug overdoses? The question is Canada dying? And that's what we're going to talk about with my next guest, Aaron Gunn.
A clear path forward requires looking back and learning. Good public policy requires human connection. It's a consideration of the facts, applying common sense, and innovation. It's urban, it's rural, it's real life. We all have something to contribute. We all have a responsibility to get informed because there's a little piece of Canada in all of us, isn't there? Let's learn on this path together. This is Leaders on the Frontier.
The downtown east side Vancouver is third world.
We live in an open prison yard.
Why should my kids have to live in that risk and that danger?
Other citizens have rights as well. You have a right not to inhale secondhand crystal meth smoke.
It's really a case of the inmates running the asylum.
What is happening to Canada, a country once considered immune from the most appalling displays of homelessness and chaos, has become an epicenter for shocking, violent, and at times random attacks as drug use has burst into the open and a devastating battle with addiction has literally left tens of thousands of Canadians dead. But what is the solution? Do we simply need a so-called safe supply of toxic drugs? Should more provinces follow the lead of BC and decriminalize fentanyl, meth, and cocaine? Or is it time to put victims first, crack down on crime, and get addicts the help and treatment they so desperately need?
I hate the word safe supply because you would probably think it was safe to take. And that's the problem, is that it's not safe.
Most people who are using this have never tried drugs before this. It's definitely creating a lot more addicts than there was before.
What we're doing now is almost capital punishment in our streets by neglect.
This is like the industrialization of addiction. It's as scary as it gets.
Aaron Gunn, the producer of that hard-hitting documentary, Is Canada Dying? Welcome to our program today.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here to chat about these issues.
Well, Aaron, speaking of these issues, you're taking on two big issues in our country today. One is about the whole policy about drugs, specifically the whole idea of safe drug supply. And secondly, you're talking about the issue of criminal changes to how we treat offenders in the law. So why did you decide to take on those two big topics, those two big policy areas that are impacting Canadians?
Well, I think growing up in coastal British Columbia, you've seen these issues getting worse and worse. You've seen these random violent attacks, which you mentioned. You've seen the homelessness issue get worse and worse, just this general kind of chaos and disorder in our streets. And obviously the overdose deaths, over 2,000 in British Columbia alone last year, dead from drug overdoses. And I really want to know, because I had a feeling that these might all be connected. And the other reason I really set out to make this documentary, as you obviously know here in BC, it's been almost impossible to challenge the orthodoxy on these issues, this harm reduction or so-called harm reduction orthodoxy that has been in place for pretty much the whole time I've been politically active or aware, certainly over the past 20, 25 years. And as somebody who lives here and walks down these streets, to me, it's kind of like, if this is success, what does failure look like? And yet all we hear is a doubling down on the exact same policies or arguments from certain individuals that we haven't gone far enough. And from my perspective, I thought it was time to have an actual debate or discussion about these issues. And maybe there's another side to the story, and maybe we should explore it.
Exactly. Now, Aaron, you use the word orthodoxy. What do you mean by orthodoxy?
Well, I guess so, as it pertains to the harm reduction.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's an ideology, really. I think it's this ideology of probably stems from an ideology of a group of people in our society that don't believe in individual agency or individual responsibility, or the if something happens to an individual, it's always society's fault at large, and thus society should pay the consequences for that, as opposed to the individual absorbing them. So I think there is a real ideology or orthodoxy around these kinds of issues. Again, to me, though, I think most Canadians, most British Columbians aren't ideological. They just want policies that work, and they're busy raising their families and going to work and living their lives. And to me, it's just so obvious that over the past 20 years, what we've been doing hasn't been working, and violent crimes have been getting out of control. I chatted with only one made it into the video, but a handful of mothers whose sons were murdered by repeat violent offenders who should have never been out on our streets in the first place. You see everyday businesses having to deal with the consequences of prolific offenders that just, it's in the jail one day, out that afternoon and committing the exact same crimes, whether it's shoplifting or vandalism, and the businesses that are having to deal with this. And then talking just to the everyday residents who no longer feel safe, whether it's riding the transit systems in Calgary or Toronto, or whether it's walking in parts of downtown Vancouver, or smaller cities like Victoria and London and Kelowna. So I think it's a combination of these issues where this isn't right. Clearly, the interests of criminals and certain advocacy groups are being placed ahead of those of everyday tax-paying citizens, and I think there's a general degree of people being fed up. And I don't think it's ideal. I don't think it's left or right. The people that are, I think it's just normal people that are saying this is out of control. So those are the issues that I wanted to focus on. And then, of course, with regard to safe supply, the really kind of disturbing fact set that our government is now fueling the next wave of this crisis.
So well summarized, Aaron. So I did want to walk through a bit more systematically the points that you make in the documentary, because it is really well done. I do recommend it to people. In fact, it's amazing. As of this date, you've already surpassed 1 million views. Are you surprised by that?
Well, I had another documentary before this called Vancouver is Dying, which was definitely the biggest documentary that I had done. And the question really was, after I did Vancouver is Dying, is people reached out to me from across the country and said, you have to come to my city, like insert Canadian city here. The same thing is happening. And maybe it's not as bad as Vancouver. Vancouver is still kind of the epicenter of this. But, the same criminal justice policies of the federal government, the same easy access to opioids and drug policies being pushed by the federal government are in play in most of the country as well. And when you copy and paste the same policies, you get similar results. So that being said, you never know when you put out a video how it's going to do. And this was a lot longer than anything I'd done before. The average, I used to mainly do 3-4 minute videos, and then the average documentary maybe 25 minutes, and this is 80 minutes long. And we might normally interview 8 or 9 people. We interviewed 49 for this project. So it was much different in scale and scope. So I wasn't sure how it's going to do, but it's nice to see the response from Canadians. I mean, it's unfortunate in some degree as well, because it shows that these problems are very real and impacting people's lives, and they're looking for alternatives.
On that note, I did want to talk a little bit about the whole phenomenon of random assaults in our country. And you had mentioned that as of March 23rd, in Canada, I believe that was the statistic, they're up by some 32%. It's really quite disturbing. And so my question is this: what are random assaults, and why did you begin the documentary talking about that particular issue?
Well, I think random assaults or random murders are, to differentiate them, are basically are assaults or murders that are random, that aren't targeted. Obviously, there's another issue of kind of gang violence and things like that happen. That's targeted. That is obviously concerning for its own reasons, but it has less of an impact, I think, to people's personal safety or the average citizen's personal safety. safety. Contrast that with random attacks, and these are people that are just going about their daily lives downtown, and then who are just violently assaulted.
Innocent
So
Canadians.
innocent Canadians, yes. And the well, why we chose to start the documentary with that is simply, I think, because it's been in the news a lot, and because the thesis, I think, running throughout this whole documentary is that the addictions crisis that is in part currently being fueled by government policies is leading to a lot of these other externalities. So the random violence, a lot of that is being driven by drug-induced psychosis or mental illnesses that have been set off by addiction and drug issues, and you can't separate the two; they're connected. And I talk to police officers. Obviously, there's always been crime and violent crime, but these random assaults, these people, it never used to happen to the way they're happening now. Every week there's something. There was a 16-year-old boy waiting to catch the subway in Toronto who's just stabbed to death randomly. It's not like he's getting mugged. He just randomly.
And this was the story, Aaron, of Gabrielle Magalhaes, as I recall.
Yeah. So that's one of the ones we started with. There's the young father outside of Starbucks downtown Vancouver on Granville Street that got a lot of attention. There's other people stabbed to death on the SkyTrain in Vancouver, buses in Toronto, and elsewhere as well. So it's in Edmonton. There was a very prominent attack of a mother and her young son that got randomly attacked and murdered for no reason in broad daylight. And again, this isn't like your traditional warped serial killer. These are happening in broad daylight.
That is just horrific. I just cannot imagine the carnage this makes on people's lives and their families, their friends, the whole community. It just sends a trauma wave through. Like, the consequences of that are hard to wrap one's mind around.
Yeah, everyone forgets that there's a cascading, when someone is violently attacked or murdered, especially when they're murdered, there is, the consequences of that ripple throughout families, ripple throughout communities.
Yeah, I think that's a very good insight as well. So within this context, I think, again, what you're doing, and again, this is a marvelous documentary, Aaron, that you and your team have put together, because it's really revealing how the world has changed profoundly, almost behind the scenes. Like, our justice system is not what you think it is anymore. And at the same time, the ground has shifted when it comes to drug policy in this country. So I did want to talk more about that. I think most people realize that the number of Canadians that are overdosing is an epidemic. Is it as really bad as we say it is?
I mean, I can't believe it. I mean, it's 6,000 Canadians, mainly young Canadians, sons and daughters, mothers and fathers that overdosed and died last year, preventable deaths.
6,000.
6,000 people. I mean, it's the population of a small town. And I mean, this is an increase of over 1,000% from about 15 years ago. It is a absolutely shocking number. It should shock the consciousness of any Canadian. Over 2,000 of those are in BC, which is even more shocking from a per capita
But
perspective.
what an absolute train wreck and waste of human life.
There's no larger waste of human life happening in the Western world right now. I mean, it's just, if I remember, not that it's a great comparison, but these are young. These are young people. These are people that have their entire lives in front of them. These are people that leave behind family members, and that rippling of trauma and sorrow that goes throughout the communities. And I remember in our when we were in Afghanistan, I mean, we lost, I think, 155 Canadians over around a 10-year commitment.
Yes, that's right.
Which was the largest loss of military life since the Korean War in this country. And every time a body came back, it was very sad and traumatic for the country, and rightly so. But to put that in perspective, of there's 6,000 people dying preventable deaths every single year in this country. This isn't cancer or something that's kind of a fact of life that we're trying to solve as much as we can. This is completely preventable, and it's I think says a lot about where society and where our culture is at right now. But it's and you're always going to have some of this, but the way it's been turbocharged and exacerbated by our own government and our own government's policies is very disturbing. And I mean, it should be a top issue for all Canadians, really.
So I do want to zero in then on that seminal point about drug policy. We've heard a lot in this country about the claims that somehow policymakers talk about a safe drug supply. What does that mean, and is it safe?
Well, the first thing I'd say is I think it's an oxymoron. I don't think there's when it comes to opioids, which is what they're talking about, there is no such thing as a safe supply, or a safer supply, as some of them have now started calling it. What they are, well, some activists mean different things, but in general, what they're talking about is the provision of drugs in a uh, from a from a chemistry perspective that are pure. I guess from like a pharmaceutical grade drugs,
Right.
in
As opposed to
consistent,
being made in someone's basement or something like that.
yeah, in consistent and predictable quantities. Now, a couple fallacies out there is you hear a lot about, the toxic drug crisis, in the sense that we have a toxic drug supply. I mean, it's so misleading. The drugs themselves are toxic. That's what it's not there. There isn't like the drugs have been contaminated.
Right.
Fentanyl will kill most people in very small amounts. Um, if you or I took, pure fentanyl, we would die virtually any amount outside of a very controlled medical setting. So these drugs, it's not that the drugs have been poisoned; the drugs are the poison. So that's the
Right.
first
Yeah.
thing to kind of
Drugs
wrap.
are a problem.
Yeah, the drugs are the problem in the first place, and supplying more of them is just going to get you more drug use. Now, their argument is that people will be less likely to overdose if they are using drugs that are of a consistent potency. Let's say is maybe the best term to
Okay.
use.
So if you're an addict, you might as well take quote safe drugs and not get something that's contaminated in that drug.
Yeah, so that's one thing that they're saying. So when I originally made the documentary, that's what I assume was more of the problem. That's not really the problem. The bigger thing is that they don't know the potency of the fentanyl. So I'll explain. When I started to make out the documentary, I thought most people were dying from fentanyl overdoses because other drugs like cocaine or heroin were being laced with fentanyl. That is not what's happening. The addicts are addicted to fentanyl and seeking out fentanyl. Now, some of these activists will say that when they're doing fentanyl made in someone's basement, you don't know the exact potency of any given batch. Where obviously, if it's made in like a laboratory by a farm, you understand maybe how many milligrams you're taking, a little bit more. But what the Safe Supply program is specifically doing right now is they're handing out something called hydromorphone, which is almost a pill form of heroin or a heroin substitute. It is
The
an
so-called
opioid.
dillies.
So Dilease is short for Dilaudid, which is a brand name of hydromorphone. It's about 3 times more powerful than OxyContin, to put it in perspective, which is obviously what fueled the opioid crisis in the first place. And they're being literally handed out like candy on Halloween by the federal government across the country.
So just to clarify, so you're saying the federal government is handing out these drugs to people?
En masse. Now you have to. Sometimes you get tested, sometimes you don't. But basically, you walk into one of these addiction clinics that's specifically sponsored, safe supply clinics sponsored by Health Canada, which is another story. And you say you're addicted to fentanyl and you would like a prescription to so-called safe supply. You get the prescription. The geniuses that thought this up in Ottawa somehow thought that addicts addicted to fentanyl would then instead take these hydromorphone tablets, which are notionally safer. It's an opioid. You can overdose on it just as like you can with fentanyl as well. But what they don't understand is the people that are addicted to fentanyl are addicted to the high that they get from fentanyl. That's why literally they risk their. I mean, they're not stupid. They understand the risk. They know better than anybody the risks of doing fentanyl. Yet they continue to do it every single day, and they're doing it in spite of those risks. And one of the things, because it's so risky, is you get a comparatively incredible high, which is what they're seeking. So if you give them a drug that has an inferior high from their perspective, they're not going to use it. Instead, they turn around and sell it to get the money to buy the fentanyl that they actually want. Meanwhile, those drugs that they've sold or traded to their drug dealers onto the black market then need to go find a different home. And these drugs are now being sold en masse, university campuses, college campuses, and even on high schools.
So on that point, Aaron, you've alluded to this. It's like these policies, these governments are really facilitating the development of the next generation of drug users, really young people, and it's very, very heartbreaking. So we do have a clip from the documentary that we'd like to play now that talks about that a little bit.
This is a 16-year-old girl currently in recovery from hydromorphone addiction. When did you first hear about hydromorphone, or what kind of names are people using for it on campuses?
So obviously being young, you don't know too much about what everything's called, what the professional names for, let's say what it is. So it would be dilly or dilaudid and stuff like that. Nobody ever really calls it hydromorphone or anything like that.
And when did you first hear about it? Do you remember, or when did you first notice people using them? Or
I'd say when I started grade 10, beginning of grade 10, so beginning of last year, it almost destroyed my life.
Thanks to our own government introducing safe supply drugs like hydromorphone into street circulation, it has now never been cheaper or easier for children to get their hands on highly addictive and deadly opioids. Are people using it, you think, even younger than grade 10?
I see 14 and 13-year-olds using hydromorphone. Sometimes even 12-year-olds. It's I hate saying it out loud because it's you almost don't want to believe it. It doesn't seem real at all, but it's so real.
I am now seeing much younger people than I've ever seen in my life. I even had a 15-year-old patient who is in grade 9 tell me he started when he was in elementary school.
And what kind of opioids are these?
It would have been Dilaudid.
At the direction of our federal government, hydromorphone has flooded our streets and into the pockets of our children.
That is a very moving clip, Aaron, and those must have been very difficult interviews for you to undertake.
They were. I mean, it was when I set out to make this project, I wasn't expecting to end up in that room interviewing that 16-year-old girl. It was like every kind of discovery led to another one, and it's just as she says that there's a fire. Purdue Pharmaceuticals with the mass distribution of OxyContin created this inferno of addiction that's been spreading throughout our country and has taken tens of thousands of lives in this country alone. And the government's attempting to put it out by pouring kerosene on it.
So I did want to shift to the theme of hope. And one of the things I found very moving within the documentary is you talk about the theme of hope, both in terms of individual lives and even jurisdictions. And one of them is the province of Alberta, the so-called Alberta model that's known internationally around the world. I was really impressed. I didn't have an idea of how ambitious and the scale of effort going on to deal with this drug crisis. Can you tell us more about what the Alberta model is?
Yeah, so to the extent that we have a fork in the road, and there's a bunch of people that want to, in British Columbia, they think the solution is to hand out more drugs. In some cases, the exact same drugs that caused the problem in the first place. In Alberta, they're doing a different approach. It's called the recovery-oriented system of care, and that is a recovery and treatment-based model that places hope at the center of what they're trying to accomplish and works to get these people the help that they need to get them clean off of drugs and to return them to being productive, tax-paying, and law-abiding citizens of society once again. And the goal there is to build these mini communities. They're building 10 of them. The first one that we toured is already finished. I don't know if it's open yet. It'll be opening very soon. And the idea is to build these recovery centers and, with the idea that this is an extension of healthcare and should be accessible to all Albertans. And it's already seen the steps that have already been taken have seen tremendous amount of success. And the idea is, I think, to place, on one hand, I would say from an overarching perspective, the goal is to make it easier to get into treatment than it is to get your next fix. So I think it is, it's already, I think, proving successful. And a big part of it is also changing a culture, because culture is very important. And in British Columbia, you've got a situation where you basically told people that this is your lot in life and the government's going to provide you with as much drugs as you need for the rest of your life. And here's a hotel room and here's a lock to close your door and good luck with everything.
Wow.
And in Alberta, they're going to instead be taking away those drugs and saying, here's another option, and helping to guide people through that. Again, and this is not just a simple detox program. This is a cohesive and very robust treatment facility. And another thing is I always point out the hypocrisy on this, because if you're Justin Trudeau or you're Jagmeet Singh, the two politicians that are the most vocal proponents of this policy, and one of your kids or family members become addicted to these drugs, the solution for them is not going to be, here's some hotel, crime-ridden hotel, and here's a bag of free drugs. Good luck. That's not what they're going to get. They're going to get world-class treatment, abstinence-based treatment, and recovery, and the skills that they need to turn their lives around. And that's what they're going to get. But for some reason, these politicians think that for everybody else in society, working class Canadians, Indigenous Canadians, all they need are this so-called safe supply of drugs. So I think it's hypocrisy at the highest level, and a really disturbing amount of it.
Well said, Aaron. So thank you so much, Aaron Gunn, the producer of Canada is Dying, the documentary, and I encourage you to watch it. So thank you so much for joining us and for your courage and your leadership.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for watching Leaders on the Frontier. We're a nonpartisan think tank. We explore ideas, policy, and practical solutions that can make a difference in the lives of Canadians. We do not accept any government funding. We work for you. Thank you for supporting Frontier. Visit fcpp.org to give. While you're there, be sure to check out our latest articles and research. Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.